When we were looking at comparative advantage theory, we talked about terms of trade or exchange rate. What is terms of trade? Well, terms of trade is simply the rate of exchange of one good for another when two countries are trading with each other. You know, when we are trading with another country, we need to find out the exchange rate or terms of trade. Now, when you look at terms of trade, the formula for terms of trade is simply it's a ratio of the average prices of exports over the average price of import expressed as index. So what we'd say is this, that our terms of trade is equal to index of export prices over index of import prices. Now, we've already formed indexes when we were doing, for example, a chapter on inflation. In an index, basically what we do is that we have a basket. So we create, in this also a case, a basket for exports, where we take some, let's say, 100 goods, and we look at the prices of those goods. In the basket for this, you might not have 100, but you might have more goods. Similarly, you have a basket for import goods, and you look at how the prices are going. You have a base here, of course. Whenever there's an index, there's always a base here. So what you look at is that you find out your index of export prices over index of import prices times 100. So let's do an example. Let's say you have a base here, which is, let's say, your beginning when you are starting to look at prices. Index of export, let's call it px, to be in the base here to be 100, because in the base here we value everything at 100, and index of import to be 100 as well. So if you look at the base here, your terms of trade TOT will be equal to 100 over 100 times 100, or in other words, terms of trade will be 100. But let's say next year, in the next year, year one, if I say this, that your px is rising by, let's say, 5%. So px becomes, for example, 105, right? But at the same time, import prices are rising by 1%. So they become 101. Now, if I ask what our terms of trade will be, it will be like 105 over 101 times 100, or it will be equal to, if you do the math, 103.9. Now, you can see, guys, that the export prices are rising faster than import prices. Export prices rose by 5%, import prices rose by 1%, which means that terms of trade has gone above 100, is now at a value of from 100 to 103.9, which means terms of trade has gone up by 3.9%. That means basically, simply, on average, a country is receiving better prices for its exports than it is for its imports. So in this case, we will say the terms of trade have improved, because for every given import, we are giving up less of our exports, because our exports are now rising faster than import. Now, what if I do this, guys? What if first year one, you have another sort of numbers? What if export prices were going up by 2%, so that's 102, but import prices were rising by, for example, 5%? So now export prices are rising faster than import prices. Now, if you find out terms of trade for this example, it's going to be 102 over 105 times 100, or in other words, it's going to be 97.14, which means in this case, the on average, a country is basically receiving higher prices or paying higher prices for its imports than it is receiving for its exports, which means in this case, I can say the terms of trade has actually worsened. So when the value of terms of trade is less than 100, we say it has worsened. When it's more than 100, we say it's gone up. So when the value is 97.14, this means we are now giving up more of our exports for any given level of imports. Now, when we look at the factors that can affect our terms of trade, there are many, because when you look at terms of trade, it is basically export prices over import prices. So the idea goes this, that anything that can exchange, that can affect our export prices or import prices can affect our terms of trade. So the first thing that we look at is simply exchange rate. We know this, that if the exchange rate of a country goes up, right, then the exports will become expensive, imports will become cheaper, and that can cause px over pm, which is your formula for terms of trade, px to go up, pm to go down, or the terms of trade to go up. Now, this could be misleading because terms of trade going up because exchange rate going up means simply that your export prices are becoming better than import prices. But what if your goods are not inelastic? If your goods are elastic, this may have a bad effect on our balance of trade. So while we're looking at exchange rate, I would like you guys to also think about this with a pinch of salt, because what if your balance of trade is not improving? So we'll talk about terms of trade and balance of trade relationship in a little while, but terms of trade going up necessarily is not good news. Another factor that can affect our terms of trade is inflation. When you look at inflation, inflation is a rise in general price level. When the price level goes up, for example, price level goes up because of any factor, exports will become expensive, imports will become cheaper. And again, px over pm, if you look at the formula, px will go up, pm will go down, and the terms of trade will go up. Now, this is again bad news for a country, because although the terms of trade is going up, but inflation is not desirable, and that would again mean we need to look at not only terms of trade but also the elasticity of demand for exports and imports to understand whether our balance of trade, which is simply your x minus m, your net exports, whether net exports is going up or not. So while we are looking at our inflation as a factor that can improve your terms of trade, but it can also harm your overall situation of the economy. One positive factor that can make the terms of trade to actually go up is what we call the demand for exports or imports. Let's say demand for exports go up. So let's call it dx for demand for exports. If demand for exports go up, we know this the price of exports will go up. But that's good news. Why? Because here demand is going up, and because of that exports are becoming going up in terms of prices, which means px is going up. Let's say pm is the same, then that would mean my terms of trade will improve. Now, this is a great factor because when the demand goes up, you are looking at terms of trade to go up, and that's good because that would mean your expenditure or revenue from your exports will also go up, which means your x minus m balance or balance of trade will go up. Another positive factor to consider is rising productivity. If there is a rise in productivity in the domestic market, that means exports will become cheaper. Now, that is not a bad thing to happen, because although your terms of trade, which is px over pm, will basically be going down. Why? Because px is becoming cheaper, so terms of trade will fall. But that may not be bad for the country because of the rise in competitiveness. So while we look at terms of trade, we can see what is important to look at is not only what is happening to terms of trade, but why is the terms of trade changing? The cause of the change of terms of trade has to be identified in order to understand it, whether it's a good factor or a bad factor. For example, rising productivity is a great factor which can make a country more competitive. So this is an important thing to understand when it comes to terms of trade. While the terms of trade provides an important information in terms of export prices and import prices, we need to basically be careful about whether the terms of trade can be useful or not. And the usefulness may depend upon the relationship between what we call terms of trade and balance of trade. So let's look at that in detail. When we look at the relationship between terms of trade and balance of trade, terms of trade, let me reiterate, is simply px over pm times 100, right? Which is the ratio of prices. But balance of trade is simply much more, because balance of trade is your export expenditure minus import expenditure, or x minus m. So when we look deeply into x minus m, we know this, that x is simply price of exports times quantity of exports minus price of imports times quantity of imports. So in other words, we need to look at not only your terms of trade but also balance of trade, which means there is a very important role of elasticity. Let's take an example. What if exports are price elastic? In the case of exports being price elastic, we know this, that let's say if exports prices are going up, when you look at terms of trade will simply be px over pm. So terms of trade will improve because exports are elastic. But if exports are becoming expensive, we know this, the quantity of exports will fall by much more. Why? Because the goods are elastic. So when the quantity price goes up, quantity will fall by much more. And if that happens, then what basically we can argue is that export expenditure will fall. And if export expenditure falls, then your x minus m falls, or your balance of trade will also fall. Which means that when the exports are elastic, one could argue this, that the terms of trade will go up when the exports become expensive, but the balance of trade will fall. On the other hand, let's do another example where the terms of trade and balance of trade will both improve at the same time. What if exports are price inelastic? If the exports are price inelastic, we can say this, that when the price of exports go up, terms of trade will simply go up, because terms of trade is px over pm. I'm rewriting this. This will go up, and therefore terms of trade will improve. But the balance of trade, which is simply your x minus m, will actually go up, because now if the exports become expensive, quantity of exports will fall by much less because they are inelastic, causing export expenditure to go up, or in other words, x minus m to go up. So the argument we can raise is this, that your balance of trade and terms of trade are related to each other, and what we need to see is whether they are elastic or inelastic. Also, the improvement in terms of trade standalone may not mean anything. We need to look at the causes as well as our terms of trade and balance of trade, whether both are improving at the same time or not.